Hi, and welcome to Public Sphere's Substack Live. I'm pleased to welcome Stanford professor and former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who also has a Substack of his own called McFaul's World. And more importantly, he's the author of a new book called Autocrats versus Democrats: China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder. He details the challenges of Chinese and Russian expansionism, as well as how the US might be able to confront these powers and regain some of its global leadership. We're going to chat for about a half hour. So, my first question is you write in 1991 was a glorious moment to be a Democrat, liberal, capitalist, multilateralist, and American.
Mm.
How are you feeling now?
Well, Luke, first, thanks for having me. Great to be with you. That I forgot I wrote that, but it was a glorious time. I was actually living in 1991 in the Soviet Union when and watching as tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of Russians were demanding democracy, were demanding independence for Russia, and they wanted to be part of the West. So I think that's why I wrote that sentence. 3 decades plus later, I'm less optimistic about all those things. Most certainly, the United States is not a global hegemon. We now have powerful autocratic countries in the world challenging our primacy that we had before, China and Russia being at the top of the list. Number two, the whole world doesn't want to be democratic anymore. And there are even, millions of people in Hungary and Italy and America that are also not so sure that democracy is such a great system of government. So that's new. And third, on the international order, around that time that are, talking about this 3 decades ago, it seemed like the international order was working. And I think the peak of it was when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and George H.W. Bush got the whole world together to say, we can't let this stand. We can't let annexation stand. And everybody, including the Soviets, including the Chinese, agreed. And then we collectively pushed Saddam Hussein out. And it seemed like this thing called the liberal international order was working. Uh, that's obviously not the case today, where we're divided as a world over what Russia is doing in terms of annexation in Ukraine. So it's a much more pessimistic time than in 1991, for sure.
So, are we in a new Cold War?
My first answer is yes. My second answer is no. And both of those answers are true at the same time. I wrestled with that assertion, theory, hypothesis in the book at length. And I came to the conclusion that there's some things that are similar, some things are different. So let me go. I won't go through all of the on the list. I talk about it in the book, but some of the big ones. So let's first start with China. China, uh, some of the similarities when we talk about U.S.-China relations. First, both are superpowers and are well ahead of the rest of the pack when it comes to metrics of military power, economic power. That's like the Cold War. Second, like the Cold War, China is governed by a dictatorship, the United States by democracy, although struggling to keep it. That is like the Cold War when the Soviets were autocratic, we were democratic. That is true too. Third, there is competition between the United States and China everywhere in the world. And that is also like the Cold War, where we competed in Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, Latin America with the Soviets. We are now doing great power competition, not just in Asia and not just in our part of the world, but it's all over the world. That's like the Cold War. And then fourth, tragically, I predict in the book that this is going to last for decades, just like the Cold War did. So that's on the similarity side. But the differences, I think, in some ways are more important than the similarities. And let me just focus on two or three, not the whole list. But first, really big difference, of course, is that the Chinese economy and the American economy are intertwined. That was not true during the Cold War. Moreover, the Chinese economy is intertwined with the rest of the global world, the global economy. That wasn't true in the Cold War. And that means we have to have a different strategy for dealing with China compared to the Soviets. And I think if we dream about going back to a blue economy and a red economy and that they'll be separated, one, I don't think we need to, by the way. I don't think that's in America's national interest. And two, if trying to do so, we're going to fail. We're not going to achieve that. So that's one big difference. Second big difference. Yes, there is ideological competition in the world. My book is titled Autocrats versus Democrats. And at the same time, the ideological competition between China and the United States is not as intense, is not as acute, and is not as threatening to the United States as was ideological competition during the Cold War. A lot of politicians and even some academics use this phrase that China is an existential threat to the United States. I don't think so. Existential means literally a threat to our existence. And that is definitely not, in my view, the case. I don't see the Chinese trying to wipe us off the face of the earth, nor do they have the capabilities. And therefore, that's a difference. And I think we got to account for that in terms of our foreign policy. And then, third big difference is about us. Um, we're much more isolationist in terms of our thinking about the world, we Americans, and that isolationist tendency is strongest in the Republican Party, but it is growing in the Democratic Party without question. That's new. We didn't have that during the Cold War. And B, the level of polarization in our country is also a lot deeper. We had polarization in the late 60s, early 70s about the war in Vietnam and civil rights movement, but I think it's much more acute today than it was then, and that's a big difference. And then one more, I just did China, but let me do
Yeah, I was going to ask about
quickly
Russia. Yeah, are we in a
Russia.
Cold
Let
War
me
with
let me do
Russia?
Russia
Yeah.
too, and it's a
So,
similar thing. Similarities, differences. Similarities, both great powers, although, distance, Russia's not as powerful as China. Ideological competition is there, like the Cold War. Um, and world aspirations, the Russians have aspirations all over the world, not just in Europe. Um, but on the differences side, they're equally important. And let me just emphasize two, because I don't want to go on too long. One, we didn't have annexation during the Cold War. Now that's a component of U.S.-Russia relations. That's different. Um, and two, we do have ideological competition like we did during the Cold War. But today with Russia, and I would say with Russia more than China, that competition, that ideological competition, is not just between states, it's within states. So Putin is propagating a set of ideas. I call it illiberal populist nationalism. And originally he just focused on his country, but now he's been pushing those ideas around the world, especially in Europe and the United States, so that now you have this competition within Hungary, within Italy, within France, and within the United States of America about competition between autocrats versus Democrats. That's new. We had some communists in America during the Cold War, and there were most certainly some liberals, small L liberals inside the Soviet Union, but they were marginal in their societies and in terms of their governance. Uh, those ideas, Putinism is not marginal in Europe or the United States. And that's different. I mean, think about this. Like, I'm talking to you. I've been doing a lot of podcasts. Um, I'm not invited to InfoWars, the famous podcast. They're not interested in my ideas over at InfoWars, but they have on this guy, Alexander Dugin, all the time.
right.
And he- that's different, right? He's a
Yeah, I
Putin
mean,
guy, and that's a
Dugin is
real
a
challenge.
Russian nationalist, but I doubt that Donald Trump has even heard of Alexander Dugin. I mean,
Yes,
he's quite
good
obscure,
point.
and I also think
Yes,
I wonder like how you think about ideology because the Soviet Union had Marxist Leninism, and that was an ideology that people sought to. I mean, sometimes it was by force, obviously in Eastern Europe, but some people in Africa, genuine in Latin America, genuinely believed it. However
yep,
flawed it was, but Putin's ideology. I mean, I wouldn't. Putin believes in capitalism, through and through. There's not really Trump, I'm sure maybe you have thoughts about similarities with Putin and what the relationship is, and so on and so forth. But Trump came up with all of this, isolationism, make America great again, not on his own, but it goes back a great deal in American thinking back to
yes,
Charles Lindbergh and people like that. So I would
yes,
push back on the suggestion that like Putin has some sort of ideology because it seems to be like the commonality between Trumpism and Putinism, it seems to be like post ideological. It's like one day we want peace, and then one day we want like war against Venezuela. It's very,
right.
very flexible.
Well, that's a great point. And Trump in the recent weeks, since and I published my book 9 months ago, right? So
Right.
he's definitely doing some surprising things with respect to my assumptions about isolationism. It was not on my bingo card that we were going to threaten to invade Greenland or go to war with Venezuela. And if he does those things, then the isolationism tendencies that he had in his first term when we withdrew from TPP and the trade global
Paris
Paris Climate
Accords.
Accords and
Yeah.
Iran nuclear deal and the INF treaty. There was a real strong. We don't want to be involved in this stuff, and now that he's problematized, he's doing different things that I was surprised by. But your other point about ideology is an important one, and so let's wrestle with it a little bit. I've been teaching about ideology for most of my life, and I think we get a little too hung up in academia. I'll just cite my own colleagues about what's a real ideology and what's not a real ideology. I just think of ideology as a set of ideas that influence behavior of states, regimes, and countries. I don't get hung up on whether it's real or not, and most certainly Marxism, Leninism, to your point, was a much more comprehensive set of ideas about how to organize societies, economies, and the world than illiberalism. Um, but if liberalism is an ideology, and I don't think there's much argument about that, then I think illiberalism is also an ideology. Like, how can the opposite of liberalism not be an ideology? It's more cynical, it's less developed, and to your point, it's much more opportunistic. I think that's a really important point. Flexibility is an important attribute of it. But I do think it is a worldview that is out there and whether President Trump, I don't know the president personally, but he's a very flexible guy. He now wants state-owned enterprises, right? Like that sounds pretty
Right.
communist to me.
Right. That's it's
But
like
but 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 the idea of that there is this movement of illiberal internationalism that is international, I
right.
think is there. But you also made a very important point, Luke. I want to underscore it because I don't want to be misconstrued. I don't think Putin exported those ideas to the Americans that believe it. I think it organically grew in a lot of different places, and then they found each other along the way. That's different than like the Soviets exporting their Marxism, Leninism to Angola or Mozambique, where they had a much more heavy-handed way of doing it. And by the way, sometimes they used soldiers to do it, right? They
Right.
invaded
Right.
countries to do it. But that's not what Trump is doing today.
Right. And Putin did it like or not even Putin, but like the Russians say can do it on Facebook or whatever in
Exactly.
2016.
Good
So
point.
it's much smaller. But do you think Russia is a great power because it has a much smaller economy than the United States, and it doesn't. We just talked about ideology. Would you like? How do you think about Russia? Is it a regional power as Obama suggested, or was kind of a diss? Like, how do
Right,
you where do you put Russia in that framing?
right. So I'm just looking at the comments as they roll along, and somebody said I should go on Joe Rogan. And if you have friends or contacts with Joe Rogan, I'd
I
happily
have
go on
no
Joe Rogan.
contact with Joe Rogan. Yeah,
Well, if anybody else listening, just so you know,
okay.
I'm willing to talk to anybody as long as it's civilized and it's not name
Yeah.
calling. So, but great question. And I have a complicated answer in the book, and I'm not going to try to go through everything. In terms of capabilities, and I have lots of tables in the book that goes through military power, nuclear weapons, economic power, soft power, right? How many the best universities in the world are not on almost all of those metrics except for nuclear weapons. That's the one place where Russia is still a superpower, just like us. China's way behind. Russia is on the capabilities uh, much farther back. Economic size, they're 11th. GDP per capita, they're like 55,
Italy, like around
56.
Italy, I think.
We're
Yeah.
they're around Italy, yeah. So,
Yeah.
so basically, in intentions, if you think about these three countries that are most prominent in my book, they're in a distant third. But when you add intentions, which I think is really important to do, what we've seen tragically over the last several years, going all the way back to 2008, when Putin first invaded Georgia, Putin doesn't have as much capability, but what he has, he's willing to use in much more aggressive ways. And I would say much more aggressive than either Xi Jinping or President Trump, at least so far. And that, I think, even when I was in the government, I think we missed that. It's easy to count soldiers, it's easy to count GDP, it's easy to count ships, in the case of China versus the United States. It's hard to understand intentions. And that's why I think Russia, despite not having as much capability, in many ways is a much more threatening power in terms of international stability than either Xi Jinping or Donald Trump today.
But I'm interested what you said about being in the government because you were U.S. ambassador to Russia. You were like face to face, I imagine, with him when he was giving these lectures about what he refers to now as the root causes, quote unquote, like the
Yes,
the end of the Cold War. And you were also like the public villain in his biggest challenge to power so
right.
far in 2012.
Yeah.
What do you think are his like biggest resentments and also like fears?
Great question. Um, so let me start with what it's not. It's not NATO expansion. That's a big debate that we have here in our country and around the world. And let me explain. It's really about democratic expansion. What he really fears is these ideas and people that believe in him. And that's why in 2012, as you rightly point out, that was the biggest mobilization against his regime ever. Biggest mobilization, social mobilization in Russia since 1991. And 1991 was the year that there was regime change. That's the year that the Soviet Union collapsed, right? So when that started to happen on the streets of Moscow. And I just coincidentally, I want to emphasize that correlation is not causation, right? I just coincidentally became the ambassador at the time, but he blamed us for that. He blamed me, he blamed Obama, Clinton, and me for, that I was sent, his propaganda said that I was sent to foment revolution against him. Um, and and I want to say at the first response to that, I want to say, well, that's completely nonsense, right? I wasn't sent there by Obama to overthrow the regime. I didn't have millions of dollars that I was handing off to the opposition. It was not some CIA conspiracy to overthrow him. That is just not true. And when people say that, there's no facts to support that claim. But but um, I think we need to be honest. At least I need to be honest. Some of the things that I did as an ambassador, and some of the things that we did in the neighborhood, including in Ukraine, the United States, were threatening to him because we did support democratic ideas. We did support openness. I spoke about when Alexei Navalny was arrested. I criticized that when a punk band, and Luke, you and I just met, so I can't say this word. I'll spell it, Pussy. When that the riot band, when they were arrested for a concert they did in a church, and they got draconian off, 2 years in jail for doing that. I criticized it. That's a threat to Putin. Um, and even in a more smaller way, one of my Russian colleagues said this to me, who knew Putin well. And when I was ambassador, I was a pretty open guy. I was on Twitter.
Yeah, I
Had we
remember.
had
Yeah,
Substack, I would have been on Substack. And I
right,
was told to be by Hillary Clinton. She said, "You got to get out there and interact with Russians, Mike, not just government officials, not just other
right.
diplomats." So I did. And I was the coach of my son's basketball team, right? And I used to write about that. And I would take photos of us, practicing. Um, and my Russian friend said, Mike, you don't realize it, but that's why Putin hates you. You're not going to see him tweeting about his kids in this open way. And I think we need to acknowledge that the ways we do things do undermine the legitimacy arguments that autocrats like Putin make.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's kind of wild to think about that time because I interviewed like your one of your successors, John Sullivan, and like none of that
Oh,
was
you did?
even, yeah, none of that was even possible. He was like
Right.
completely isolated, and
Shut down.
I don't even know who the U.S. ambassador to Russia is right now, but I can't imagine it's like a very fun job.
No.
You're pretty shut down, and
Yeah.
so on and so forth. When
We
you
don't
look,
we don't have an ambassador right now, just so you know.
we don't.
The
Yeah,
the last
exactly.
ambassador, her name was Lynn Tracy. She just left a few weeks ago.
Right,
I know
right. That was the
Lynn.
name who I was
She
thinking of, but she
Yeah,
left
she just
apparently, and I
left.
missed it.
And I don't think
So,
anybody wants that job, to your point.
right,
It's a
right.
hard
It's
job,
it's a
so
pretty thankless job. So, so I wanted to ask, like, you were in Russia in 1991 when everything seemed possible, and then 2012 when the door was kind of closing. Did you
yeah.
sort of see Russia sort of further autocratizing? Is that even a word? Becoming an autocracy, or like I'm just curious what your viewpoint was like at that time and sort of looking back because it's a pretty
Yeah.
broad sweep of history.
Yeah, well, I was optimistic in the early 1990s. I even went back after the Soviet Union collapsed and worked for an American non-governmental organization that supported democratic ideas. And by the way, we were the invited guests of the Russian government at the time. This notion that we were always anti-Russian and fomenting revolution. No, we were part of a movement inside Russia, and they wanted us to be there. They wanted to learn, very mechanical things like how does federalism work? How does different electoral systems work? That's what we were doing. We were like running seminars for members of parliament. Um, I think in retrospect, we didn't do enough. The West did not do enough to help them consolidate their democracy. That was a very difficult time in terms of economics. It was a
Yeah,
deep, deep depression, 3 times worse than our depression in the 30s. We should have done more to help with that. Um, and we should have done more on the democracy side. We just kind of thought everybody was going to become democratic, right? That was the mood of the time. And so we didn't put enough effort into it. I still think was the right think, Mike, you just were completely naive. These imperialists, they were always imperialist, always were, always will be. I think that's not right. But we should have had a hedge. We should have had a plan B to do more for countries like Ukraine and Georgia when we had more power to do so and Russia didn't, including just arming them back then so that it
Yeah.
would raise the costs of intervention. I think that was a mistake. Democrats and Republicans made that together. About the future, I would just say I don't know, and I don't trust anybody that thinks they know. Feels like this regime is pretty ensconced. Definitely nothing's going to happen as long as Putin is there. But
Right.
it's a pretty personalistic regime. And so I will predict with great certainty that Putin will not rule Russia forever. I'm going to go out on a limb and predict that. And when he's no longer in power, I do wonder. I just, I know Russian and Soviet history, and anytime you've had a strong dictator for a long time, uh, the next leader is a little more pluralistic. So Stalin was there for a long time, and then in
You
a
had
few
some
years with
opening
that
with Khrushchev. Yeah. Yeah.
Khrushchev.
Yeah.
Same
Yeah.
after Brezhnev, you got Gorbachev. And
Yeah.
maybe I'm just trying to look for silver linings, but I think that could be a possibility after Putin.
So you talked a little bit about the Chinese threat to global peace and security. We've talked about the Russian threat. My question now is like, what about the US? In many ways, like I'm thinking about middle powers like Brazil and India. Like if I'm one of those countries, I might be looking at, these three countries and thinking like, maybe the US is the bad guy. They slap tariffs on us
Yep.
and they're threatening military action against our neighbors. Like, is the U.S. in some ways, also a threat to global peace and security now? I mean, yeah,
Yes. Well, another great question, and I don't have an easy answer. But my quick answer is yes. And I hope we're not going to do this for a long time. So two pieces to build on what you just said. First of all, with respect to India and South Africa and Brazil, I would put all three of those countries. They're all democracies. We have complicated relationships with all three, but we can't push them into the Chinese orbit. And by slapping tariffs on them and disrespecting them, the way we've treated all three of those countries, I just don't think are in America's long term interests. We need them to be on the Democratic side, and we got to act a little more democratic ourselves. Second, this gets back to a thread we started with about Trump. This unilateral use of power, and there's all this threatening stuff about Venezuela. I don't support that. Now, I am no fan of Maduro. He lost the election. Gonzalez won. We should have done more. The Biden administration should have done more to help the actual Democratic winner of that election take power. We missed an opportunity there. But to invade, I go through it in my book, just so you know, we're 4 for 17. When we use military to try to promote democracy, it doesn't work out very well.
right.
And B, I'm just, President Trump's never shown a big interest in promoting democracy. So why all of a sudden are we supposed to believe that's his mission statement here? But the other piece that you hinted at, if we act like cowboys and we coerce people, whether it's tariffs or military force, we have enough power to get a lot of things that the president may think are good for America. And that's just the nature of the balance of power. But I can tell you, I travel a lot around the world. Nobody likes to be coerced. Nobody likes to be bullied. And eventually, when they have other options, they might look for other partners. And if we were the only game in town today, I would say, okay, well, it's our way or the highway. What can you do? But we're not. China's out there offering a different set of ideas and a different set of practices. And so far, they're not slapping tariffs on people because they played an ad that they got offended by. And so far, they're not invading countries and bombing countries. And I just think to play this game for the long haul, we have to have a more cooperative approach, especially when it comes to democratic countries.
Yeah, I mean, you look at India, and right after Trump slapped tariffs on India, Modi goes to China and, embraces
Yeah.
Putin, embraces Xi. India and China are, sworn enemies. So, really
Yeah.
says a lot about how destructive that strategy is. But I just want to sort of end on the US, and you have a lot of suggestions at the end for improving US foreign policy and democracy at the end, which I think are sensible, and I think most people wouldn't disagree with, like increasing foreign aid and so on and so forth. I mean, they were not controversial until Trump sort of destroyed USAID in all these countries and all of these sort of institutions. But my question is, do you think that the US will have like even a chance to implement some of your suggestions? Because I was thinking about this today. I don't even know if like USAID can be put back together
Put
again. I
back
mean,
together. Yeah.
thousands of people have died already because of
Yes.
malnutrition, and Nick Kristof in the Times has done
Yeah.
a
Incredible
great
reporting.
job
Yeah.
for like reporting about this. But what's your take on all this? Because I read it and I was like sensible, but like, how is any of this ever going to happen? I mean, maybe I just
Well,
lack an imagination. You
that's a
know?
great way to end.
Yeah.
And the epilogue of the book is "Don't bet against America yet." And
Okay.
within that, I say, "Don't bet against small d Democrats around the world yet." And my response is twofold. One, I don't know. I just analytically, I don't know the answer to your question, and we just need to be sober about that. That it's hard to predict the future. I do know a couple of things as a social scientist, and then I'm going to end as a small d Democrat. So I do know, as a historian who's looked at this history, that we've had other moments of democratic recession in the 1930s, in the 1960s and 70s, and we've come back as a world and as a country. So that gives me optimism that it can happen again. Second, I do know analytically that if we stretch it out 300 years, that there are more democracies today than there were back then. There were zero back then. And we're in a democratic recession now, but over 300 years, the trajectory towards more open societies, more democracies, less monarchies, less Communist Party dictatorships, history, the data's on my side. And then the third thing I would say is I wrote the book to be in the argument about these things. I
Yeah.
think I think for too long we left the American people out of these debates, and elites on the coast just talk to ourselves. These things are all self-evident, but they're not self-evident to a lot of Americans. And Trump has some
What do you mean by
compelling
things?
arguments.
What do you mean by
Like
things?
USAID, we should have
Right. Right.
USAID. Like that's self-evident to my world. But I'll tell you, I was at the University of South Carolina last week. I was in Texas 2 weeks before. A lot of Americans is not self-evident too. And Trump, he's a really good communicator. And so I think the reason I wrote the book when I'm chatting with you is we got to get out there and make these arguments and
Hmm.
to help Americans understand why, in the long run, things like USAID, Voice of America, National Endowment for Democracy, soft power instruments, they worked well in the Cold War and they can work well again, but it's going to be an argument. It's not going to be self evident. And I'm willing, so far, I like, I've had a lot of arguments about a lot of things. And I've learned, by the way, I've changed even since the book's been published.
Yeah.
I've changed some of the ways I've talked about them. But I think in the long run, the ideas of Democrats are better than the ideas of autocrats. And that makes me cautiously optimistic.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for
All
having
right.
me.
Have a great day.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.